Jesus Christ actually existed, actually walked this world, did predict his own death and resurrection, and then if you could have a camera running on the tomb in and around 33 AD, that an actual Jesus would have walked out on the third day after his crucifixion and burial.
See, that is the crux of this, isn't it? Is that whether Jesus of Nazareth was resurrected.
In this interview with Piers Morgan, Wes Huff makes a lot of bold claims, given his track record of overstating the evidence and being called out by skeptics. We'll see whether he's become more careful and nuanced this time around. If he has, he deserves credit. If not, I'll do my part to fill in the gaps and set the record straight. Let's get into it.
But how much of that faith is based on historical evidence?
Right from the start, Piers Morgan sets the focus. This isn't just about Christian beliefs, it's about whether there's any historical evidence to back them up. Wes Huff isn't just here to preach theology. He's going to argue that the resurrection of Jesus is supported by tangible, verifiable facts. That's the claim on the table. Wes Huff begins building his case by establishing that Jesus existed.
I think we can say pretty unequivocally that a character, a first-century Jewish itinerant rabbi by the name of Jesus of Nazareth, did walk the dusty streets of first-century Roman-occupied Judea.
That's actually a solid starting point. If we are going to argue that someone rose from the dead, it's only fair to first demonstrate that this person existed in the first place. And I'm not here to dispute that. I think the historical evidence for the existence of Jesus is quite strong. It doesn't take a lot of evidence to believe that a traveling Jewish teacher lived in first century Roman Palestine. Lots of people did. This isn't the controversial part. The real question, the one that actually matters in this discussion, is whether this man came back from the dead. That's an extraordinary claim, and it should require a much higher standard of evidence. And just to be clear on why we would want to ask for more evidence, let me give you an example. If you tell me you had scrambled eggs for breakfast, I will take your word for it. That's normal. But if you say you had scrambled dinosaur eggs, I am going to assume you are joking, or speaking metaphorically. Maybe you just meant you had a big breakfast. But if you double down and insist, no, I really ate scrambled dinosaur eggs this morning, I'm not going to believe you, not without a lot more evidence than your word. That's not hyperskepticism. It's not even skepticism, I think. It's basic human reasoning. We all naturally demand stronger evidence for unusual claims. Hello, my friends. This is Shane at Mindful Living. On this channel, I talk about the importance of self-awareness and critical thinking. We all have blind spots and double standards, and being mindful of how we evaluate ideas helps us stay consistent, make better decisions, and avoid being misled. I believe religion is one area where we especially need this kind of mindfulness. It's easy to unconsciously lower our guard and suppress critical thinking when a topic turns spiritual or supernatural. That's why a healthy level of skepticism isn't just helpful, it is essential, especially when we are being asked to believe extraordinary claims. Wes Huff has just given us reasons to believe that Jesus actually existed, but that's just setting the stage. The real question is, what does he offer to support this extraordinary claim that Jesus was actually resurrected? Let's take a look.
Jesus Christ actually existed, actually walked this world, did predict his own death and resurrection, and then if you could have a camera running on the tomb in and around 33 AD, that an actual Jesus would have walked out on the third day after his crucifixion and burial.
And this is where things quickly go off the rails. Wes Huff just can't help himself. He jumps straight from a reasonable claim that Jesus existed to a completely unfounded one, that if you had a camera rolling outside the tomb, you would have literally caught Jesus physically walking out of it on the third day. That might sound vivid and compelling. The problem? It's not in the Gospels. In fact, none of them describes the moment of resurrection, not one. There is no scene in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John where Jesus is seen walking out of the tomb. What the Gospels describe instead is that the tomb was later found empty, and that some of his followers claim to have seen him alive afterward. That's a big difference. Even the Gospel of Matthew, which gives the most dramatic scene at the tomb, doesn't depict Jesus emerging. Instead, it describes an angel descending from heaven, rolling away the stone, and telling the woman that Jesus is already gone. This detail matters. The stone isn't rolled away so Jesus can exit. He's already left. The angel rolls it away so the woman and Jesus' disciples can look inside and see that the tomb is empty. The emphasis is on the aftermath of the resurrection, not the event itself. So while Wes presents this vivid image of Jesus stepping out into daylight, it's not something the gospel writers describe. And it's certainly not something supported by historical evidence. Sure, if Jesus was truly resurrected, he could have walked out of the tomb, or even passed through the stone without needing it rolled away. But that's speculation, not documentation. Once we start blurring the line between what is historically attested and what might have happened, we are no longer doing history. We are drifting into theology and imagination. And in a conversation framed as being about historical evidence, that distinction matters. Let's see where Wes goes from here. Spoiler alert, it gets worse.
Where is the actual hard evidence for you as an historian that that actually happened?
Yeah, I think we do, Piers, have a historical question in terms of we have an actual character who we can demonstrate that lived, and then we have that same character being demonstrated in multiple independent and cross-reference sources, chief of which we call the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But just because those are religious texts now doesn't necessarily negate that they are historical texts. These were independent written sources that come from the time frame.
Wait, what? Wes, you can't be serious. Come on, you are a New Testament scholar. You of all people should know better. The Gospels are not independent sources. Let me explain. We have 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But scholars have long recognized that these are not 4 completely separate accounts that just happen to agree. In fact, most scholars agree that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a primary source when writing their own Gospels. That means when Matthew and Luke describe events similar to Mark, they are not giving us separate independent eyewitness testimony. They are often copying or adapting from the same source. In some cases, the wording is nearly identical in the original Greek, which strongly suggests direct literary dependence. So that's not independence, that's interdependence. It's like reading 3 students' essays and realizing 2 of them copied large sections from the first. So when Wes Huff describes the Gospels as these were independent written sources that come from the time frame, that's just not true. At least not in a sense historians mean when they talk about independent attestation. If you want to claim something is historically reliable, it helps to have separate, unrelated witnesses telling you the same thing. But that's not what we have with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are more like variations on the same template. John, to his credit, is more distinct in content and style, but it's also written much later, and we cannot rule out the possibility that he knew and read the first 3 Gospels. So even though it looks different, that doesn't automatically make it an independent source. So no, Wes, citing the Gospels as independent sources doesn't hold up. And if this conversation is supposed to be about historical evidence, we need to be more honest about what kind of sources we are dealing with.
If we want to know about someone from the ancient world or history in general, we go to the earliest sources, preferably eyewitness sources. And I think that's what we have within the Gospels. So we have a character who lived, who died, and then a character who is said by an early Jesus community to have been resurrected. And the accounts of that are not just kind of scant. They're not seeing Jesus off from afar as some sort of apparition or something like that. And what we have is the case of instances of the early Jesus community saying they walked with him, they talked with him, they ate with him.
Let's take a closer look at what Wes Huff is really saying, because details like this matter. He claims the Gospels are eyewitness accounts, but that doesn't hold up when we actually look at the evidence. Even a traditional view acknowledges that Mark and Luke weren't disciples of Jesus. So even if they did write the Gospels attributed to them, they wouldn't be eyewitnesses. And today, most scholars agree that the Gospels of Matthew and John were also likely not written by Jesus' disciples. There's simply no solid evidence that the actual disciples of Jesus, who were likely illiterate Aramaic speakers, wrote this sophisticated Greek text decades later. Some Christians might point out that Matthew was a tax collector, so maybe he was literate. But being a Jewish tax collector in Roman-occupied Palestine didn't require fluency in Greek writing. Collecting tolls or local taxes likely meant basic math and speaking enough Greek to interact with officials, but not composing full-length narratives in polished literary Greek. Writing a gospel required far more than everyday literacy. It took formal education, advanced rhetorical skill, and training that only the elites had access to. Some might suggest that the disciples told their stories in Aramaic and that a scribe translated and wrote them down in Greek. But that's not how things worked at the time. We have no examples of literary works being produced this way in that period. It would require not just any scribe, but a professional bilingual writer, someone fluent in both Aramaic and literary Greek. And people with that kind of education were typically upper-class elites who wouldn't have worked for rural Jewish peasants. And even if Matthew did write a gospel, we have to ask, why does he copy large sections word for word from Mark, including the story of his own calling by Jesus? If he were truly one of the disciples, why would he need to rely on someone else's version of events who wasn't even there? It's also worth noting that all four Gospels are internally anonymous. None of them says, I, Matthew, am writing this, or I saw this with my own eyes. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added much later. In fact, the first time we see these names connected to the Gospels is around 180 CE, well over 100 years after Jesus died. That's a long time to wait before attaching authorship, and it makes those attributions far less reliable. So when Wes says we have eyewitness accounts from people who walked, talked, and ate with the risen Jesus, that's not what the evidence supports. What we actually have are anonymous texts written decades later by authors we can't identify, in a language the original disciples likely didn't speak or write. These stories were most likely passed down, reshaped, and edited within early Christian communities. And if the authors never even tell us who they are, there's no good reason to assume they were eyewitnesses, or to give them a level of credibility they never claimed for themselves. These writings may carry deep meaning for believers, but they don't carry the weight of direct, first-hand testimony. Even the idea that the risen Jesus ate with his followers isn't found in all the Gospels. In fact, the earliest Gospel, Mark, doesn't include any resurrection appearances at all. The original version ends at chapter 16, verse 8. A young man tells the woman that Jesus has risen, and they run away in fear, saying nothing to anyone. That's it. There's no moment where Jesus appears, no conversations, no meals. The longer ending that includes appearances was added later. Wes himself admits it's not original to Mark, so he can't have it both ways. He can't count Mark as an early eyewitness source and then ignore the fact that Mark doesn't show the risen Jesus at all. If this conversation is supposed to be about historical evidence, then we need to stick with what the evidence supports, and we need to be honest about the limits of what we can know. Some of you might be thinking, I'm being too hard on Wes. After all, this was a live interview. He was answering questions on the spot, and there wasn't much time to go into the fine details. I understand that, but I don't think that time constraint is a valid excuse. It doesn't take much time to avoid overstating your case. He didn't need to call the Gospels independent sources. Simply saying multiple sources would have been more accurate and just as quick. The issue here isn't a lack of time to unpack technical debates, it's the choice to paint a big picture that isn't supported by scholarship. He could have acknowledged in just one sentence that only 2 Gospels are traditionally linked to Jesus' disciples, and even those connections are debated. He could have pointed out that Matthew and Luke borrow heavily from Mark, which makes them dependent, not independent. And as a New Testament scholar, he should definitely know that none of the Gospels describe Jesus walking out of the tomb, and that the original ending of Mark includes no resurrection appearances at all. These aren't minor or obscure details, they are basic, well-established facts in New Testament studies, things every scholar in the field should know. Yet Wes presents the Gospels as if they are all independent, eyewitness accounts that consistently show the risen Jesus appearing to his followers. That's simply not accurate. When you present the Gospels this way, you are offering a version of Christianity that feels more unified, confident, and historically grounded than the evidence actually supports. Maybe it's not doing that on purpose. Maybe it's a habit. But when you are speaking as a scholar, especially to a large audience, accuracy isn't optional. Oversimplifying or overstating the case shapes how people understand the topic, and that's exactly why it needs to be called out. So far, we have only covered the opening moves in Wes's argument, and already we have found serious problems. There are still plenty of gaps to fill and claims that need to be examined more closely. This is just part 1 of the series. In part 2, we will dig deeper into what Wes says about the resurrection appearances, and we will also take a closer look at the methods historians actually use to establish historical events, something Wes doesn't present accurately in this interview. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss part 2 when it's released. And if you are not yet familiar with Wes's pattern of overstating his case, be sure to check out my other video titled Alex O'Connor Doesn't Understand Wes Huff, But You Can. You can click the screen or the link in the description below. It gives more background on how Wes argues and why critical thinking matters so much in conversations like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 2.